If you have to have things perfect in order to be joyful, you're never going to be joyful.
He's standing in front of 20,000 people, and he doesn't know yet that everything he built is already breaking. It's 2013. The cameras are rolling, the stage lights are perfect. Rick Warren is doing what he does better than almost anyone alive, turning pain into purpose, loss into a lesson, grief into a sermon that will be watched by millions. His son Matthew died by suicide 8 days ago, and Rick is back in the pulpit because that's what he does. That's what he's always done. Turn the wound into content, turn the private into the global, make meaning out of the unbearable. What he doesn't see yet is that this moment, this return, this transparency, this vulnerability is the beginning of the end. Not because he failed, but because the very thing that made him the most famous pastor in America was the same thing that would cost him his church, his denomination, and the future he thought he was building. The cruelest part is that he did everything right according to the rules he was given, and it destroyed him anyway. Rick Warren didn't lose everything because he was a hypocrite. He lost it because he was exactly who he said he was. And in the America that came after his son's death, that was no longer enough. Let's go back to the beginning. Not to his childhood, we'll get there, but to the moment when Rick Warren became Rick Warren. It's 1980. He's a 26-year-old seminary graduate with a young wife, a U-Haul, and a vision that sounds insane. He's going to plant a church in one of the least religious areas in America, Orange County, California. And he's going to make it the biggest church in the country. Not through fear, not through hellfire, through relevance, through friendliness, through making Christianity feel less like a courthouse and more like a coffee shop. He starts Saddleback Church in his living room with 7 people. Within 15 years, it's one of the largest congregations in the United States. Within 25, it's a global brand. Rick writes The Purpose-Driven Life, and it sells more than 30 million copies. It becomes the best-selling hardcover nonfiction book in history. He advises presidents. He gives the invocation at Barack Obama's inauguration. He's on the cover of every magazine that matters. And here's the key. He doesn't do it by being flashy. He does it by being safe. Rick Warren's genius was that he made evangelical Christianity feel non-threatening. He wore Hawaiian shirts. He smiled constantly. He talked about purpose instead of sin. He built a church model that could scale infinitely. Small groups, contemporary music, practical sermons, casual dress, no guilt trips. He called it seeker-sensitive. Critics called it watered down, but it worked. Saddleback grew to 20,000 plus weekly attendees. Thousands of churches copied the model. What made Rick Warren powerful was his ability to be all things to all people. He could pray at a Democratic president's inauguration and still keep his evangelical base. He could talk about AIDS and poverty and climate care and still be welcomed at conservative conferences. He was the bridge, the translator, the guy who made you feel like you could be a good person and a good Christian without having to choose between your conscience and your community. But that bridge was always more fragile than it looked, because Rick Warren's entire identity was built on a single idea, that if you were winsome enough, thoughtful enough, humble enough, and servant-hearted enough, you could unite people. You could find common ground. You could make the gospel attractive without compromise. And then, his son killed himself, and the bridge started to crack. Matthew Warren was 27 years old when he died. He'd struggled with mental illness his entire life. His parents had tried everything: therapy, medication, prayer, hospitals, experimental treatments. They were open about it. They asked for help. They did not hide. On April 5, 2013, Matthew took his own life. 8 days later, Rick Warren was back on stage. In the sermon, he was raw. He was honest. He cried. He said the things pastors aren't supposed to say, that prayer didn't fix it, that faith didn't cure it, that sometimes you do everything right and you still lose. It was one of the most human moments in modern megachurch history, and it should have made him more beloved. But here's what happened instead. The grief didn't make Rick Warren more careful, it made him more urgent. Losing Matthew didn't make him retreat into safe theology, it made him ask bigger, harder, more dangerous questions. Questions about mental health, about suffering, about who gets left behind in the church's obsession with victory and success and purpose-driven living, about why his son, raised in the most purpose-driven environment on earth, still couldn't find a reason to stay alive. And those questions led him to start shifting, slowly, publicly, in ways that made people nervous. It started small. After Matthew's death, Rick began talking more about mental health. He launched a mental health ministry at Saddleback. He started partnering with secular organizations. He pushed back against the prosperity gospel. He said that God doesn't always heal, that sometimes faithfulness looks like endurance, not victory.
Evangelicals didn't love that. The gospel of optimism was their brand. God has a plan was the cornerstone. Rick was starting to sound like he doubted the plan. Then he started shifting on other things. In 2021, he ordained 3 women as pastors at Saddleback Church. Not small group leaders, not volunteers, pastors, with the title, with the authority. It was a nuclear bomb inside the Southern Baptist Convention. The SBC doesn't allow women pastors. It's not a minor doctrinal preference, it's a defining belief. The Bible, they argue, is clear. And Rick Warren, who had been a Southern Baptist his entire ministry, who had built his career inside that tribe, had just violated the rule. He didn't do it quietly. He announced it, celebrated it, defended it publicly. He said he'd studied the scriptures for years, that he believed women were called, that excluding them was wrong. And the SBC moved to expel Saddleback Church. Stop here for a moment and understand what's happening. Rick Warren is 70 years old. He's built a church from 7 people to over 20,000. He's written one of the most influential Christian books in modern history. He spent 4 decades being the model of evangelical success. And now, his own denomination is kicking him out, not because he denied the resurrection, not because he abandoned the faith, but because he ordained women. The vote happened in June 2023. Saddleback Church was officially removed from the Southern Baptist Convention. Rick released a statement. It was gracious, it was measured, it was sad. He said he still believed in the Baptist faith, that he loved his brothers and sisters, that he disagreed with the decision but respected it. But behind the words, you could feel the loneliness. Because this wasn't just a bureaucratic move, it was a rejection, a message, a line drawn. It said, you were supposed to stay in your lane, you were supposed to be safe, you were supposed to be the guy who didn't rock the boat. And Rick had become something more dangerous than a heretic. He'd become unreliable. Then came the leadership transition. Rick Warren had been planning his succession for years. He didn't want to be the pastor who stayed too long. He wanted to hand off the church well. So in 2021, he announced that Andy Wood, a younger pastor from a multi-site meta-church in Michigan, would take over as lead pastor of Saddleback Church. It should have been smooth. It wasn't. Almost immediately, there was tension. Longtime staff members began leaving. Saddleback had always been Rick's church, his personality, his vision, his voice. Andy Wood was different, more polished, more corporate, more multi-site minded. He started restructuring things, consolidating campuses, changing the feel, and people didn't like it. By 2023, attendance had dropped. Longtime members were gone. The church that once felt like a family started to feel like a franchise. And Rick Warren, still technically on staff, still beloved by thousands, was caught in the middle. He couldn't fully let go, but he also couldn't take back control without undermining the succession he'd planned. It was a quiet unraveling. No scandals, no blow-ups, just slow drift. The thing he'd built for 40 years was changing into something he didn't fully recognize, and he couldn't stop it. Because the truth is, megachurches don't transition well. They're almost always the vision of one person, and when that person steps away, the church either becomes something new or it fractures. Saddleback was fracturing. So let's step back and see the whole picture.
In the span of 3 years, Rick Warren lost his son, his denomination, and functional control of his church. And the question everyone's asking is, why? Some say it's because he went liberal, that he abandoned biblical authority, that the women pastor issue was the final straw in a long drift toward compromise. Others say it's because the evangelical world became more tribal, more rigid, more hostile to nuance, and Rick refused to play along. But the deeper answer, the one that makes this not just a church story, but a human story. Rick Warren lost everything because he tried to be both faithful and relevant. And in 2020's America, you're not allowed to be both anymore. The entire premise of Rick's ministry was that you didn't have to choose. You could be biblically grounded and culturally engaged. You could be theologically conservative and socially compassionate. You could care about abortion and poverty. You could believe in traditional marriage and love LGBTQ people. You could be a uniter. But the algorithm doesn't reward uniters. The culture doesn't reward bridge builders. The base doesn't trust people who refuse to pick a side. And Rick Warren, for all his success, all his influence, all his good intentions, was a man caught between two worlds that no longer wanted to talk to each other. After Matthew's death, he couldn't pretend suffering was simple. After the 2016 election, he couldn't pretend the church was fracturing along political lines. After George Floyd, after COVID, after January 6th, he couldn't pretend that purpose-driven optimism was enough to hold the center. He started asking harder questions, and the people who loved him for being safe decided he was dangerous.
Here's what nobody tells you about losing everything slowly. It doesn't feel like collapse. It feels like a series of small, reasonable decisions that all make sense in the moment. You decide to be honest about your son's death, because what else can you do? You decide to ordain women, because you've studied it, prayed about it, and you believe it's right. You decide to step down and let someone younger lead, because you don't want to be the old guy who holds on too long. And then one day, you look around and realize your son is gone, your denomination has expelled you, your church is unrecognizable, and the legacy you thought you were building looks nothing like what you imagined. That's what happened to Rick Warren. He didn't lose everything because he failed. He lost it because he changed, and the people around him didn't want him to. There's a scene that keeps coming back to me. It's from that 2013 sermon, the one he preached 8 days after Matthew died. Rick is on stage, and he's talking about how his son felt like he didn't belong, how Matthew struggled with feeling purposeless, even though he was raised in the most purpose-driven environment on earth. And Rick says, through tears, "I have the answer to Matthew's pain, but I couldn't get him to believe it." That line haunts me, because Rick Warren spent his entire life offering people answers, and it worked for millions. But it didn't work for his own son. And I think that's the wound that broke everything open, because after that, Rick couldn't just preach the answers anymore. He had to sit with the questions, the ones that don't resolve, the ones that don't fit into a sermon series, the ones that make people uncomfortable. And when you start doing that in evangelical America, you become a liability. Rick Warren is 70 now. He's still alive, still preaching occasionally, still posting on social media, still trying to stay hopeful. But he's no longer the center of anything. Saddleback continues under Andy Wood, but it's a different church. The Southern Baptist Convention has moved on. The next generation of pastors don't look to Rick as the model anymore. They look to younger, sharper, more media-savvy voices. And the thing that hurts the most, I think, is that Rick did everything the way he was supposed to. He built well, he led humbly, he transitioned gracefully, he stayed faithful, and he still lost. Not because he was wrong, but because the world he built his ministry for doesn't exist anymore. The seeker-sensitive era is over. The big tent evangelicalism is dead. The idea that you can be all things to all people without betraying someone has collapsed. And Rick Warren, the man who embodied that idea more than anyone, is left holding the pieces. There's a version of this story where Rick is the villain, where he compromised too much, bent too far, lost the plot. There's another version where he's the hero,
where he had the courage to grow, to change, to put people over policy. But I think the real story is sadder and more human than either of those. Rick Warren loved his son. He loved his church. He loved his faith. And he tried, with everything he had, to make all of those things fit together. And in the end, he couldn't. Not because he failed, but because some things just don't fit anymore. That's the price of building your life on being the bridge. Eventually, both sides walk away, and you're left standing in the middle, alone, wondering if anyone remembers what you were trying to build. Rick Warren lost his son. Then he lost his denomination. Then he lost his church. And the saddest part is that he lost them all for the same reason. He refused to stop asking questions after the answers stopped working. If you want to understand what happened to American evangelicalism in the 2020s, don't just look at the scandals. Look at the good guys who got left behind. They'll tell you more about what broke than the villains ever will.